Welcome, everyone, to All Sorts Podcast. Picture this, a space filled with vibrant ideas, deep explorations, a real journey for your mind. It's all waiting right here for you.
And finding more is easy. Just hitting like, share, and especially subscribe on the All Sorts Podcast YouTube channel really opens up that world.
It does. Dive into our past deep lives, too. There's a whole library back there. Plus, you can follow All Sorts Podcast on X, Instagram, and Threads for different flavors of content every day.
A little something everywhere.
Exactly. So today we're diving deep, really deep, into a story that's, well, pretty foundational for detective fiction. We're talking about Edgar Allan Poe's The Mystery of Marie Rogêt.
Yes. And what makes it so fascinating right off the bat is that it's not just fiction. Poe was tackling a real unsolved murder from his time.
The Mary Cecilia Rogers case in New York, 1841. A cigar girl murdered. The police. Well, they didn't solve it.
Nope, they hit a dead end. So Poe, in his characteristic way, takes the whole situation, transports it to Paris, changes the name to Marie Rogêt.
But keeps the core details almost identical. He was essentially trying to analyze the real tragedy through this fictional lens.
And he even said so himself, didn't he? In a letter, he mentioned wanting to challenge the popular theory, the whole game of ruffians idea.
Right, and maybe even hint at who the actual killer might be. But his main goal, he said, was about demonstrating the right way to investigate. The principles of inquiry.
Precisely. How to think about these things logically.
So to help us unpack all of this, we've got some great sources lined up. There's an academic paper looking at narrative perspective, comparing Poe here with Agatha Christie's Five Little Pigs.
Interesting comparison. And another paper focusing on the rules of detective fiction, ratiocination in Poe's Dupin stories.
And finally, some key bits from a scholarly edition of Poe's own tales and sketches, specifically zeroing in on the mystery of Marie Rogêt. Okay, ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
So first up, how does Poe actually tell this story? That first paper digs into the narrative perspective. It says Poe mostly uses first person, a male narrator.
Yeah, Dupin's friend, the unnamed narrator, we know from the other stories. But the interesting part is the shift the paper points out.
A shift? How so?
Well, it starts as first person external. The narrator is sort of watching from the sidelines, observing the initial mess, the police fumbling, the public confusion.
Okay, like an observer.
Exactly. But then it transitions to what the paper calls first-person internal. The narrator starts recalling the case with Dupin, analyzing the details alongside him. We get closer to Dupin's thought process through the narrator's memory.
Ah, I see. So we move from outside looking in to sort of inside Dupin's analytical circle via the narrator. And the paper links this to Poe's unity of effect idea.
Right. Poe believed every single element in a story should work towards one specific pre-planned effect on the reader. Controlling the perspective, how information is revealed, it's all part of achieving that singular impact.
It makes sense. Control the lens, control the experience. How does that compare to, say, Agatha Christie in Five Little Pigs? The paper brings her up as a contrast.
Well, Christie often uses third person, right? And in Five Little Pigs, it mentions she shifts from zero focalization, like an all-knowing narrator, to multiple internal views, getting inside different characters' heads.
So a much wider view compared to Poe's focus through the single narrator, even if that narrator gets closer to Dupin. What's the trade-off there, do you think?
Good question. With Poe, staying tightly with Dupin's friend, even when he's confused, builds this intense focus on Dupin's reasoning. We learn, as the narrator learns, often after Dupin already knows. It creates suspense, maybe some frustration.
Yeah, you're waiting for the penny to drop.
Exactly. Christie's method, though, gives you access to more minds, more potential suspects, different interpretations directly. It allows for different kinds of misdirection, perhaps. Poe keeps us locked onto Dupin's track.
So Poe's first-person approach, especially that internal shift, limits our knowledge in a way, maybe causes confusion like the paper says, but also builds tension because the narrator holds back info until Dupin reveals it.
But then you have Dupin himself cutting through all that fog with pure, cold logic.
And the paper really details how he does it, step by step. He systematically takes down the bad assumptions, proves the body is Marie's.
Using logic about decomposition and things like that. He rules out the fiancé, St. Eustache, as the initial killer.
Refutes the whole gang theory, which was apparently very popular.
Very popular, yes. And ultimately points the finger through his analysis at a naval officer. It's all presented as this triumph of ratiocination, of pure reason.
A real intellectual demolition job. And then, the paper notes, We pop back out to that external view right at the end for a wrap-up.
A neat framing device.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. What about the rules of the game? This was early detective fiction. Our second source looks at this through the lens of Ronald Knox's detective story Decalogue.
Right. Knox's 10 rules, written later but often applied back to the pioneers. Several rules really fit Poe's Dupin stories quite well.
Like which ones?
Well, the big ones. The culprit has to be found through logical deduction, not just luck. The detective's job is to, detect, gather clues, analyze them.
Makes sense.
And importantly, no supernatural stuff. No convenient divine intervention or overly wild coincidences solving the case. It has to be reasoned out.
And Dupin is definitely the detective who detects. He's all about the rational process, contrasting sharply with the police who seem to jump to conclusions.
Absolutely. The paper highlights Dupin's core belief. You don't dismiss a case because it looks impossible. You take those impossibilities and you break them down logically, examine every tiny piece of evidence until they're not impossible anymore.
Like a scientist with data.
Exactly. And there was physical evidence in the real Mary Rogers case, mirrored in Poe's story. The state of the body, the torn dress.
But a muslin slip tied with a sailor's knot, that seems pretty specific.
Very specific. Plus the location, witness statements. These were the concrete things Dupin and Poe had to work with as the basis for all that analysis.
So let's connect that analysis directly to the real case.
Yeah.
Our third source, the excerpts from the scholarly edition, really emphasizes how Poe engaged with the actual newspaper reports of the time.
Yeah, this wasn't just inspired by. He was actively reading papers like Brother Jonathan and the Evening Post, digesting the coverage of the Mary Rogers investigation as it happened.
And then, as we said, he maps it onto Paris, creates Marie Rogêt, keeps the essential facts, but maybe changes some minor things.
Precisely. A sort of fictional case study built on a real foundation. The excerpts mention the early theories the public latched onto the gang violence idea again.
And the arrests Marie's fiancé, St. Eustache in the story, mirroring Mary Rogers' fiancé, and her employer, John Anderson, also based on a real person.
Right. Then the bodies found in the Seine, like Mary's in the Hudson, and the papers, like L'Etoile in the story, start debating everything. Is it really her? How long was the body in the water? Lots of conflicting opinions.
And Dupin, acting as Poe's logical mouthpiece, just picks apart their arguments.
Methodically, using observations about, how bodies decompose in water, buoyancy, things the press seem to be ignoring or getting wrong in their rush to judgment. He's applying a kind of forensic logic, really.
Then there's the added twist. St. Eustache is found nearly dead from an overdose, with a suicide note. That happened in the real case, too, didn't it? Adding another layer of confusion.
A huge layer. Did he kill her and then himself? Was he involved somehow? It complicates everything.
And if Dupin makes this interesting point, highlighted in the excerpts, that the police thought the case was easy because it seemed so ordinary.
Paradoxically, yes. Dupin argues that very ordinariness makes it harder. There are no bizarre, standout clues screaming for attention. The solution is hidden in the mundane details everyone overlooks.
So you have to look beyond the main event, the surrounding stuff.
Exactly. He emphasizes examining the collateral and circumstantial events, which is why he pores over those newspaper reports not just for facts, but for assumptions, for patterns, for what isn't being said.
The excerpts mention the papers floating various theories, including that naval officer idea alongside the gang theory.
And Dupin argues strongly against the gang theory. His logic is quite clever.
Right.
There is a big reward offered, plus a pardon for anyone who turned state's evidence.
So if it was a big gang, someone probably would have cracked under pressure, or for the money.
That's his reasoning. The fact that no one did suggests it was likely one or two people acting alone, people who could keep a secret.
And what about the dark complexion man mentioned by witnesses?
Dupin finds his continued absence suspicious. If there was a gang, where did he go? Why only traces of Marie? It doesn't quite add up for Dupin.
But, as the source points out, we don't get the full step-by-step of Dupin's final solution in these excerpts, do we? It mentions he follows a slight clue.
Right, it implies the solution hinges on something subtle, but doesn't spell out the exact deductive chain in these particular passages. Keeps a little mystery, even in the explanation.
Okay, so we have Dupin, the master of ratiocination. But our last source throws in a bit of a curveball, suggesting maybe it's not all pure logic, an undercurrent of irrationality.
It's a really interesting point some critics raise. Yes, Poe called them tales of ratiocination, linking them strongly to Enlightenment ideas of reason, deduction, logic.
The power of the rational mind.
But at the same time, you have Gothicism flourishing, which is all about imagination, emotion, the irrational, the dark side. Poe kind of sits between those two worlds.
So the argument is that maybe Dupin's methods aren't purely deductive. There's some guesswork or intuition mixed in.
Potentially. The analysis gives the example of the murders in the Rue Morgue. Dupin figures out the Frenchman is innocent partly by imagining how the orangutan could have committed the crime and escaped.
Ah, so it's not just deduction from facts, but also an imaginative leap about an animal's behavior.
Exactly. It involves a degree of conjecture, an assumption about the ape's actions that goes a bit beyond just strict step-by-step logic based purely on the physical evidence found.
So the paper suggests Dupin sometimes reasons unreasonably, blending deduction with speculation.
Perhaps. It suggests that while his analytical skills are obviously incredible, his insights might sometimes stem from a combination of that analysis and something closer to intuition or imaginative empathy. It's not always just A leads to B leads to C.
That makes Dupin even more complex, doesn't it? Not just a logic machine, but maybe reflecting that tension in Poe's time between pure reason and, well, the power of imagination.
It certainly paints a more nuanced picture.
Wow. So wrapping up our deep dive on the Mystery of Marie Rogêt, it's clear just how pioneering Poe was, creating detective fiction, blending it with a real unsolved case. It's quite something.
Absolutely. And showcasing that analytical method, even if, as we've discussed, it might have hidden depths or complexities.
We've touched on his narrative techniques, that shifting perspective. Yeah. How the story plays with the early rules of the genre.
And that fascinating debate about pure rationality versus maybe a hint of the irrational in Dupin's approach.
It really makes you think. Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Consider how much we're still drawn to true crime today. Do you think Poe's early experiment here, analyzing a real tragedy in fiction, somehow paved the way for that?
And maybe think about your own life. When you face puzzles or problems, how much do you rely on pure logic versus intuition or that imaginative leap? It's an interesting balance.
Definitely something to ponder. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration into Poe's world. If this sparked your curiosity, please do light up our channel, like, share, and subscribe to All Sorts Podcasts on YouTube.
And remember that back catalog of deep dives. There's plenty more to explore there.
Absolutely. And keep connecting with All Sorts Podcasts daily on X, Instagram, and Threads for more content. Until our next deep dive, keep questioning, keep exploring.